Before we begin, I need you to understand something. This isn't a story about trade disputes or distant diplomacy. This is a story about how one empire became the largest drug cartel in human history. Not in the shadows, but in broad daylight, with warships and treaties and the full force of civilization behind it. Tens of millions addicted, entire nations brought to their knees, and the architects, they died rich, honored, and powerful. So if you're here for the uncomfortable truth, settle in. Phone away. Distractions silenced. Let's begin. In the beginning, there was a problem, and the problem was tea. By the 18th century, Britain had developed an obsession that bordered on addiction. Tea from China had become the lifeblood of British society, consumed in drawing rooms and dockyards by aristocrats and labourers by the cup and by the gallon, until by 1800, the average Briton was drinking 2 pounds of tea per year, and the number kept rising. But tea was only the beginning. There was silk that shimmered like liquid in the candlelight of Georgian ballrooms. There was porcelain so fine that it seemed to glow from within, and the British could not make anything comparable no matter how they tried. They called it China, as if the country and the material were one and the same, because in the minds of British consumers they were. This was the problem that kept the ledger keepers of the East India Company awake at night, staring at columns of numbers that told a devastating story. Silver was flowing out of Britain and into China in a river that never reversed. Every pound of tea, every bolt of silk, every piece of porcelain had to be paid for in hard currency because China wanted nothing else that Britain had to offer. Nothing. Consider what this meant to an empire that saw itself as the apex of civilization, the workshop of the world, the master of global trade. Britain had wool, but China had silk and saw no reason to trade down. Britain had clocks and mechanical wonders, but China had its own traditions and its own timekeeping, and politely declined. Britain had manufactured goods pouring from the factories of Manchester and Birmingham, but Chinese craftsmen had been perfecting their arts for millennia and were not impressed. Every trade delegation sent to Beijing returned with the same humiliating message. We have everything we need. We have no use for your manufactures. You may purchase our goods with silver, or you may purchase nothing at all. The Emperor Qianlong put it bluntly in a letter to King George III in 1793, stating that the Celestial Empire possessed all things in prolific abundance and lacked no product within its borders, and therefore had no need to import the manufactures of outside barbarians. Barbarians. That was how the most powerful empire on Earth was described by the oldest continuous civilization on Earth, and the numbers supported the insult. In the early 1800s, Britain was sending 20 million silver dollars to China annually and getting almost nothing in return except the goods they craved. The trade deficit was not merely embarrassing, it was existential. An empire runs on money, and money was draining away toward the east, like water flowing downhill, obeying laws that no treaty could overturn. The East India Company, which had built British power in Asia, faced a crisis that threatened its very survival. Something had to change. Something had to be found that China wanted as desperately as Britain wanted tea, something that would reverse the flow of silver and restore the balance of trade in Britain's favour. The answer had been growing in the fields of Bengal all along. The opium poppy had been cultivated in India for centuries, used medicinally and recreationally in small quantities long before the British arrived. But what the British saw in those delicate flowers with their pale petals and their pods weeping milky sap was not medicine. They saw money. They saw the solution to their China problem. And in 1773, under Governor Warren Hastings, the East India Company established a monopoly over opium production in Bengal that would become the foundation of the most profitable drug trafficking operation in human history. This was not a haphazard enterprise. This was industrial agriculture, organized with the same ruthless efficiency that characterized every aspect of British imperial management. In the Gangetic Plain, stretching across Bihar and Benares, poppy cultivation expanded year by year, consuming farmland that had once grown food. At the heart of the operation stood two massive facilities: the opium factory at Patna, established in 1797, and the factory at Ghazipur, both of which still exist today as reminders of what was built here. These were not small operations. These were drug manufacturing plants on an industrial scale. Inside, raw opium was tested in examining halls sorted by quality, mixed in great vats, using what were called blind rakes to ensure consistency, then formed by hand into standardized balls, dried in earthenware cups, and packed into wooden chests made from timber shipped from Nepal. Each chest contained approximately 140 pounds of processed opium. Each chest represented enough narcotic to addict hundreds of people, and the chests kept coming by the thousands, and then by the tens of thousands, flowing out of India and toward China like a slow poison seeping into the veins of a civilization. The farmers who grew this crop did not do so freely. By the 1870s, more than 1.5 million Indian peasants were locked into poppy cultivation, many of them trapped by a system of advances they could never repay. If a farmer refused to grow poppies, the company had methods of persuasion. Contemporary accounts describe how officials would simply throw coins into a farmer's house, declaring that he had now accepted an advance and was bound to plant poppies on his land whether he wanted to or not. This was called the simple plan, and its simplicity was the simplicity of coercion backed by the power of empire. The farmers had no recourse. The company was the law. And so the poppies spread across the fields of Bengal season after season, while the factories processed their harvest into standardized product ready for export. But there was a problem. China had banned opium. The Yongjung Emperor had prohibited the sale of opium for smoking as early as 1729. And by 1796 the ban had been extended to cover importation as well. On paper, this should have ended the trade before it truly began. In practice, it merely required creativity. The East India Company could not be seen directly violating Chinese law. It had legitimate trade interests in Canton, the only port where foreigners were permitted to conduct business, and it could not risk that access by openly smuggling contraband. So the company devised a system of extraordinary cynicism. It would grow the opium in India and process it in company factories and auction it in Calcutta to the highest bidders. But it would not ship the opium to China itself. That task fell to the country traders. These were private British merchants operating under licenses from the company who purchased opium at auction and transported it to China on their own ships at their own risk. If they were caught, the company could wash its hands. It had merely sold a legal product in India. What happened after that was not its concern. The company collected the silver proceeds, the traders took the risks, and the opium flowed. The distribution network that emerged would have impressed any modern drug cartel. The country traders did not sail directly into Canton Harbour, where Chinese officials might inspect their cargo. Instead, they anchored at Lintin Island, a barren rock in the Pearl River estuary, about 40 miles from Canton. There they transferred their opium to receiving ships permanently anchored hulks that served as floating warehouses beyond the reach of Chinese law. Chinese buyers would travel to Canton, pay for their purchases at money shops that issued receipts, then present those receipts at Lintin to collect their opium. The actual smuggling into the Chinese mainland was done by Chinese vessels, narrow, heavily armed boats called fast crabs, or scrambling dragons that could outrun anything the Imperial Customs Service might send after them. By 1830, more than 100 of these smuggling boats were working the trade bribing officials at every level, from local magistrates to provincial governors to the staff of the Imperial Customs House itself. The corruption spread like the drug itself, touching everything it encountered. The numbers tell the story of an epidemic. In 1729, China imported perhaps 200 chests of opium per year. By 1800, that number had grown to 4,500 chests. By 1820, it was nearly 10,000. By 1838, on the eve of war, 40,000 chests of opium were pouring into China every year. That is roughly 2,500 metric tons of processed narcotics entering a single country in a single year. To put this in perspective, by 1858, British annual opium exports to China reached 4,500 tons, which is approximately equal to total global illicit opium production between 1995 and 2005. The British Empire was shipping more drugs to China in the 19th century than all the drug cartels on Earth would ship everywhere combined 200 years later. And the revenues were staggering. Opium became the second largest source of income for British India, representing nearly 17% of total government revenue by 1890. It paid for the tea, it paid for the administration of India, it paid for the expansion of empire. The silver that had been draining out of Britain now reversed course, flowing back from China in exchange for poison. The trade deficit became a trade surplus. The problem had been solved, but who were the men running this operation? They were not shadowy figures operating from the margins of society. They were respectable businessmen, pillars of the British merchant community in China, celebrated for their enterprise and their success. And two names stand above all others. William Jardine was born on February 24, 1784, in Lochmaben, Scotland, to a farming family of modest means. He trained as a surgeon at Edinburgh Medical School and took a position as ship's doctor on East India Company vessels, a respectable, if unglamorous, career. But Jardine was ambitious. Company officers were permitted a certain amount of cargo space for personal trade, and Jardine used his allowance to deal in opium, learning the business from the deck of a merchant vessel. By 1817, he had abandoned medicine entirely. There was more money in drugs. He settled in Canton in 1820 and eventually partnered with a fellow Scot named James Matheson to form Jardine, Matheson and Company in 1832. The Chinese had a nickname for William Jardine. They called him the Iron-Headed Old Rat. The origin of this name reveals something about the man. He was struck by a heavy pole or girder during some altercation, and he simply kept going without acknowledging the blow. He was relentless. He was indestructible. He was utterly without scruple when it came to profit. Under his leadership, Jardine Matheson became the dominant force in the opium trade, controlling by some estimates 40% of all foreign trade in China. In their first year of operation, the firm disposed of more opium than the entire Chinese import of 1821. James Matheson, born in 1796 in Sutherland, Scotland, was the intellectual partner, the man who provided ideological justification for what they were doing. He described the Chinese as, and these are his own words, a people characterized by a marvelous degree of imbecility, avarice, conceit, and obstinacy. He claimed he had never seen a Chinaman bestialized by opium use, which was a lie so transparent that it could only have been offered to audiences who wanted to believe it. Historians who have examined their private correspondence confirm that both men were fully aware of opium's lethal potential. They knew exactly what they were selling. They knew what it did to the people who used it. In their public statements, they claimed the drug was harmless, perhaps even beneficial. In their private calculations, they counted the profits. When James Matheson died in 1878, he was the second largest landowner in the United Kingdom, having purchased the entire Isle of Lewis for £190,000 and built Lewes Castle as his residence. His grave is decorated with carved poppies, a final testament to the source of his fortune. These were the men who built the machine, a surgeon turned drug dealer, an ideologue who dismissed an entire civilization as imbeciles while profiting from their destruction. They were not operating in secret. They were celebrated. They were honored. They were among the most successful businessmen of their age. And when China finally moved to stop the opium trade, these men would help design the war that followed, providing military strategy to the British government, advising on which ports to attack, how many troops would be needed, and what terms to demand in victory. But that war is still ahead of us. For now, in the 1830s, the opium is still flowing. 40,000 chests a year. 2,500 tons of processed narcotics, millions of addicts, and millions more to come. The machine is running, the silver is flowing, and somewhere in Beijing, an emperor is reading reports about the destruction of his people and deciding that something must finally be done. The opium arrived in China as a luxury. In the early years of the trade, it was the drug of the elite consumed by wealthy merchants and idle scholars in private chambers far from public view. It carried with it an air of sophistication, of cosmopolitan refinement. To smoke opium was to signal that you had the money and the leisure to indulge in exotic pleasures that common people could not afford. This is how addiction often begins, with the wealthy, with the fashionable, with those who believe themselves immune to the consequences that befall lesser men. But addiction does not respect class boundaries. It does not honor wealth or status or education. It spreads downward through society like water, finding every crack, every weakness, every vulnerable point until it saturates everything it touches. By the 1820s, opium had moved beyond the private chambers of the rich and into the tea houses and gathering places of the scholar gentry, the administrative class that had governed China for centuries. By the 1830s, it had reached the soldiers who were supposed to defend the empire, the merchants who kept its economy moving, the farmers who fed its population. By 1838, the most conservative estimates placed the number of opium addicts in China at 4 million people. Other estimates ranged as high as 10 or 12 million. And this was only the beginning. The addiction rate would continue climbing for decades. By 1906, surveys would find that 27% of all adult males in China were regular opium users. More than 1 in 4. In some regions, the rates were even higher. The scale of this catastrophe is difficult to comprehend, so let us try to make it concrete. Imagine a village of 100 families. Imagine that in every 4th household there is a man who cannot work, who cannot think clearly, who spends every coin he can beg, borrow or steal on the drug that has enslaved him. Imagine that scene repeated in every village across a nation of 400 million people. This was China in the grip of opium addiction. And the drug did not simply create craving, it destroyed capacity. Contemporary observers described addicts as listless, incapable of sustained labor or concentrated thought. The physical effects were devastating. Users developed a characteristic pallor, a wasting of the flesh, a tremor in the hands. Their eyes grew dull, their movements slowed. They became shadows of themselves, present in body, but absent in spirit. And escape was nearly impossible. One British merchant who witnessed the addiction firsthand admitted in a moment of unusual honesty that there was scarcely one known instance of escape from the bondage of opium. Once the drug had you, it did not let go. The withdrawal was agony, chills and sweating and nausea and cramps that bent the body double. Many who tried to quit simply died in the attempt. Others lasted days or weeks before the craving drove them back to the pipe. The lucky ones, if luck is the right word, simply never tried to stop. They smoked until their money ran out, and then they sold everything they owned, and then they begged and stole, and finally they died, and their families buried them and tried to forget what they had become. Commissioner Lin Zexu, who would soon lead China's attempt to end the trade, understood exactly what was happening. He wrote to the emperor with a warning that should have shaken anyone who read it. If the opium trade continued, Lin warned, then the Chinese empire would have no peasants to work the land, no townsfolk to pay taxes, no students to study, and no soldiers to fight. This was not rhetoric, this was prophecy. The military dimensions of the addiction crisis would prove devastating when war came. Officers who were supposed to lead their men into battle were instead enslaved to the pipe. Soldiers who were supposed to defend the gates of empire could barely lift their weapons. The drug that Britain was pouring into China was not merely an economic commodity, it was a weapon. It was destroying China's capacity to resist anything that might come next. And it was draining China's wealth as surely as it was draining its people's lives. For centuries, silver had flowed into China from around the world. European traders hungry for Chinese goods had paid for their purchases in hard currency because China accepted nothing else. This silver accumulated in Chinese treasuries funded the operations of government circulated through the economy as the primary medium of exchange. The silver standard was the foundation of Chinese commercial life, but opium reversed the flow. Chinese smokers needed silver to purchase their drug from foreign smugglers, and that silver left China never to return. Between 1800 and 1840, the opium trade drained at least 300 million silver taels from the Chinese economy. To understand what this means, consider that the entire annual spending of the imperial government was approximately 40 million taels. Commissioner Lin calculated that Chinese opium smokers were consuming 100 million taels worth of opium per year. That is more than twice what the government itself spent on everything from military defense to infrastructure to the administration of an empire spanning millions of square miles. The money that should have built roads and bridges and schools was instead flowing into the pockets of British drug dealers. The consequences rippled through every level of Chinese society. As silver left the country, its value increased relative to copper, the currency used for everyday transactions. Peasants who earned copper coins and paid taxes in silver found that their tax burden was effectively doubling, even as the government collected the same nominal amount. Merchants found credit harder to obtain. Trade contracted. Economic activity slowed. Historians call this the Dagong Depression, named for the Emperor Dagong, who ruled during these terrible decades. It was not caused by drought or flood or war or any natural disaster. It was caused by opium. It was caused by a deliberate policy pursued by the British Empire to addict the Chinese population and extract their wealth in exchange for poison. The human face of this catastrophe could be seen in the opium dens that proliferated across China. In Shanghai, the largest den was called the Nanjing Tsin, and it could accommodate 150 smokers at a time. There was rarely a vacancy. Visitors described long rooms filled with wooden platforms where smokers lay side by side, each with his pipe and his lamp and his pellet of opium warming over the flame. The air was thick with the sweetish smoke. The only sounds were the bubbling of pipes and the occasional murmur of dreams spoken aloud by men and women too far gone to know or care who was listening. Yes, women. The addiction did not spare them. Contemporary accounts noted that women formed a fair proportion of the smokers in many dens. Protestant missionaries who arrived in China in the mid-19th century were so horrified by what they saw that they established refuges specifically for female opium addicts trying to save those who might still be saved. The dens were everywhere and they were spreading. In the port cities that served as entry points for the drug, whole neighborhoods became dedicated to opium consumption. Around each den, an economy of desperation emerged. Pawn shops where addicts traded their possessions for enough money to buy another pipe. Moneylenders who extended credit at ruinous rates, knowing that addicts would pay anything for their next fix. Fences who purchased stolen goods, no questions asked, because theft was what addicts turned to when everything else was gone. Families were destroyed. A father who became addicted would sell his children's food to buy opium. A mother who became addicted would neglect her infants until they sickened and died. The bonds of obligation and affection that held society together were dissolved by the drug, leaving nothing but the craving and the desperate scramble to satisfy it. In the villages and small towns, the patterns were similar if smaller in scale. A farmer who began smoking to ease the pain of labor in the fields would find himself unable to stop. His productivity would decline. His fields would go untended. He would borrow money to buy opium using his land as collateral, and when he could not repay, he would lose everything his ancestors had worked generations to build. His family would scatter. His neighbors would shake their heads and pray that the same fate would not befall them, but often it did. The opium spread from friend to friend, from relative to relative, from one household to the next, like a plague carried not by fleas but by the long bamboo pipes and the little pellets of brown paste and the sweet, seductive smoke that promised relief from every worry. and delivered instead enslavement unto death. This was what Britain was doing to China, not through war, not through conquest, not through the direct exercise of military force. Britain was conquering China one addict at a time, destroying the health of its people, draining the wealth of its economy, undermining the capacity of its government to govern, and calling the whole enterprise commerce, calling it free trade, claiming that any attempt to stop the flow of drugs was an intolerable interference with the natural rights of British merchants. And when China finally did attempt to stop it, when the emperor sent his most trusted commissioner to Canton with orders to end the opium trade by any means necessary, Britain would reveal what had been true all along, that the trade was backed by force, that the commerce was simply another name for conquest, that the opium and the cannon were two aspects of the same imperial project, and that any nation that resisted would learn the cost of resistance. But that war is still ahead. For now, in the late 1830s, China is simply dying, slowly, village by village and family by family and soul by soul. The dens are full, the silver is flowing out, the pipes are lit, and the smoke rises into the air, carrying with it the dreams of a civilization that does not yet understand how thoroughly it is being destroyed. In late December of 1838, the Daoguang Emperor made a decision that would change the course of Chinese history. For years, he had watched the reports flowing into Beijing from the southern provinces, each one more alarming than the last. His people were being destroyed by a foreign poison. His economy was hemorrhaging silver. His officials were corrupt. His soldiers were useless. His empire was rotting from within. The debates at court had raged for months, with some advisers arguing that legalization and taxation might at least bring the trade under control, while others insisted that only total suppression could save the nation. The emperor sided with suppression, and for this impossible task he chose a man whose reputation was beyond reproach. Lin Zexu was 53 years old when he received the imperial summons. He had served the empire for 25 years in positions across China, from flood control to judicial administration to provincial governance. Everywhere he went, he had earned the same reputation. They called him Lin the Clear as the heavens, or sometimes Blue Sky Lin, because his integrity was as vast and unsullied as the sky itself. In an empire where corruption was endemic, where officials routinely enriched themselves at public expense, where bribery was so common that it was simply assumed, Lin Zexu stood apart. He could not be bought. He could not be intimidated. He pursued justice with the same relentless determination that William Jardine pursued profit. The emperor appointed him imperial commissioner, with extraordinary powers to travel to Canton, the epicenter of the opium trade, and end it by whatever means necessary. Lin departed for the south in January of 1839, and everything about his journey signalled his intentions. Most officials of his rank would have travelled with a vast entourage, hundreds of attendants and guards and servants, all requiring lodging and food and entertainment at government expense, all creating opportunities for corruption and graft. Lin travelled with almost no one outrider, 6 guards, 3 kitchen staff. That was all. He would not burden the treasury. He would not provide opportunities for bribes. He would arrive in Canton as clean as he intended to leave it. He reached his destination in March of 1839 and immediately began to move. There would be no period of adjustment, no gradual escalation, no diplomatic niceties. Lin understood that speed was essential. Every day that passed meant more opium entering the country, more addicts created, more silver leaving more damage done. He had to act before the foreign merchants could react, before the corrupt officials could hide their tracks, before the momentum of the trade could overwhelm his efforts. In his first weeks, Lin arrested 1,700 Chinese opium dealers. He confiscated 70,000 opium pipes. He summoned the 12 Kohong merchants, the licensed Chinese traders who served as intermediaries between foreign merchants and the Chinese market, and he called them what they were: traitors. For decades, decades, these men had facilitated the opium trade, grown wealthy from it, looked the other way while their countrymen were destroyed. Lin gave them 3 days. In 3 days, they were to persuade the foreign merchants to surrender every chest of opium in their possession. If they failed, they would be executed. The Kahong merchants went to the foreign factories, the walled compound in Canton, where British and American and other Western traders lived and conducted their business, and they delivered Lin's message. The foreigners were not impressed. They had heard threats before. Chinese officials had periodically made noise about the opium trade, issued proclamations, demanded surrenders, and then accepted bribes and allowed the trade to continue. This would surely be the same. They did not understand that Lin Zexu was different. When the deadline passed and the opium had not been surrendered, Lin acted. He surrounded the foreign factories with troops. He withdrew all Chinese servants from the compound, leaving the merchants to cook and clean for themselves. He cut off food supplies. He announced that no foreigner would be permitted to leave until every chest of opium had been handed over. Approximately 350 men were now trapped. Among them was Captain Charles Elliot, the British Superintendent of Trade, who had rushed to Canton when he heard of Lin's actions. Elliot was a complicated man. He privately detested the opium trade, calling it, in his own dispatches, a disgrace and a sin that was staining the British character with deep disgrace. But he was also a servant of the Crown, and his duty was to protect British subjects and British interests, whatever his personal feelings. Faced with Lin's siege, Elliot made a fateful decision. He promised the merchants that the British government would compensate them for any opium they surrendered. In effect, he transformed private property into a government obligation. He was betting that Britain would honour this promise and would recover the value of the opium from China by force if necessary. It was a bet that would lead to war. Over the following weeks, the merchants surrendered their opium. The final count was staggering. 20,283 chests, more than 1,300 metric tons of processed opium. It was the largest drug seizure in human history, and it would not be surpassed for over a century. Lin now faced the question of what to do with this mountain of poison. He could have burned it, but he feared that the smoke might intoxicate nearby villagers, or that corrupt officials might somehow salvage usable opium from the ashes. He chose instead to destroy it completely. At Human Beach, near the mouth of the Pearl River, workers dug 3 massive trenches, each one 150 feet long and 75 feet wide. 500 labourers worked under Lin's direct supervision. The opium was broken out of its chests and thrown into the trenches along with water salt and lime. The workers stirred the mixture with wooden poles, breaking up the balls of opium until nothing remained but a thick brown sludge. Then the sluice gates were opened and the whole mass was flushed out into the sea, carried away by the tide, dissolved and dispersed and destroyed beyond any possibility of recovery. The destruction took 23 days from June 3rd to June 25th of 1839. Lin composed an elegy to the gods of the sea, apologizing for polluting their realm with this filth, explaining that it was necessary to save his people from the poison that had been inflicted upon them. Foreign observers were invited to witness the destruction. Lin wanted the world to see China's determination. He wanted there to be no doubt that the opium was truly gone and that China would not tolerate this trade any longer. Thousands of Chinese citizens gathered to watch. For them, this was a moment of national pride. Their government was finally acting. The poison was being purged. The nightmare was ending. They did not know that the nightmare was only beginning. In July of 1839, Lin Zexu did something remarkable. He wrote a letter to Queen Victoria. It was an appeal to conscience, to morality, to the basic principle of reciprocity that underlies all human ethics. Lin knew that in Britain the use and sale of opium was strictly regulated, that the British would never permit this drug to destroy their own population as it was destroying China's. He made this the foundation of his argument. We have heard he wrote that the smoking of opium is very strictly forbidden by your country. That is because the harm caused by opium is clearly understood. Since it is not permitted to do harm to your own country, then even less should you let it be passed on to the harm of other countries. The logic was irrefutable. Britain did not allow widespread opium addiction at home because the British understood how destructive it was. Yet Britain was actively promoting this same addiction in China, profiting from the destruction of millions of lives. How could this be justified? Lin asked Victoria to consider a hypothetical. Suppose there were people from another country who carried opium for sale to England and seduced your people into buying and smoking it. Certainly your honourable ruler would deeply hate it and be bitterly aroused. Lin listed the regions of British India where opium was produced: Bengal, Madras, Bombay, Patna, Benares, Malwa. He knew exactly where the poison came from. He urged Victoria to eradicate the opium plant in these places, to hoe over the fields entirely and sow in their stead the 5 grains, the staple crops that fed humanity rather than destroyed it. It was one of the most eloquent moral appeals in the history of international correspondence. It was clear and logical and devastating in its implications. It placed the responsibility for the opium trade exactly where it belonged, on the shoulders of the British Crown and the British government and the British people who profited from addiction and called it commerce. The letter never reached Queen Victoria. The ship carrying it was intercepted, or perhaps the letter was simply never delivered by British officials who understood how damaging it would be if made public. We do not know exactly what happened. We only know that Victoria never saw it. Historian Arthur Whaley later wrote that had the inexperienced young Queen received it, she might well at first have doubted whether we ought to persist in what Gladstone called this most infamous and atrocious trade. Perhaps it would have changed nothing. Perhaps the economic interests were too powerful, the merchants too influential, the momentum of empire too great to be stopped by a single letter, no matter how compelling. But perhaps not. Perhaps a young queen, only 20 years old, confronted with the moral reality of what was being done in her name, might have hesitated, might have asked questions, might have demanded answers that her ministers could not provide. We will never know. The letter vanished. The trade continued, and the war that Lin's actions had made inevitable was already being planned in London. In the autumn of 1839, William Jardine, the iron-headed old rat, sailed from China to London, carrying something more valuable than opium. He carried a plan. For years, Jardine had been the dominant figure in the China trade, growing rich from the drug that was destroying Chinese society, building a commercial empire on the backs of millions of addicts. Now his trade was threatened. Lin Zexu had confiscated and destroyed more than 1,000 tons of his merchandise. The Chinese government had made clear that the opium trade would no longer be tolerated. A lesser man might have accepted the loss, cut his losses, and found some other commodity to sell. Jardine was not a lesser man. He understood that the opium trade could only continue if China was forced to accept it, and China could only be forced through military action. So he sailed for London to make his case. In October of 1839, Jardine secured a meeting with Lord Palmerston, the Foreign Secretary. Palmerston was a pragmatist unconcerned with moral questions where imperial interests were at stake. He listened as the drug dealer laid out a comprehensive military strategy for conquering China. Jardine provided everything: which ports to attack and in what order, how many troops and ships would be needed, what terms to demand in the eventual peace treaty, where to establish permanent British bases. It was a complete war plan designed by a man who knew the Chinese coast better than any admiral in the Royal Navy, because he had spent decades smuggling drugs along it. Palmerston adopted the plan virtually unchanged. Later, after the war was won, he would acknowledge his debt to Jardine, writing that it was mainly owing to the assistance and information which you and Mr. Matheson so handsomely afforded us that we were able to give our affairs naval, military, and diplomatic in China those detailed instructions which have led to these satisfactory results. Let this sink in. The war that was about to be fought was designed by a drug dealer, not by generals or admirals or strategic planners in the War Office, by a man whose sole qualification was his expertise in smuggling narcotics into a country that had banned them. The British government did not merely protect the opium trade, it outsourced its military planning to the opium traders themselves. But a war requires justification, at least for public consumption. The British people could not be told that their sons would be sent to die so that merchants could continue selling poison. So a propaganda campaign was launched. Jardine himself orchestrated much of it, commissioning a best-selling author named Samuel Warren to write pamphlets presenting the conflict as a matter of British honour rather than British greed. Warren's pamphlet, The Opium Question, never mentioned addiction or the destruction of Chinese society. Instead, it portrayed China as an arrogant, backward nation that had insulted British dignity and mistreated British subjects. The opium was an afterthought. What mattered was the insult. What mattered was that China had dared to treat British merchants as criminals when they were merely engaging in legitimate commerce. The war was reframed as defence of British subjects against what Palmerston called a set of barbarians, a set of kidnapping, murdering, poisoning barbarians. The irony of calling the Chinese poisoners when Britain was literally flooding their country with poison was apparently lost on Palmerston. Or perhaps not lost, but simply ignored, because the purpose was not truth. The purpose was justification. When Parliament debated the war in April of 1840, the opposition came close to stopping it. A censure motion condemning the government's actions failed by only 9 votes, 271 to 262. For a moment it seemed possible that conscience might prevail, that Britain might step back from this disgrace. But 9 votes was enough. The war would proceed, and it would be like nothing China had ever faced. The instrument of British victory arrived in Chinese waters in 1840, and the Chinese had no name for what they saw. They called it Gui Chuan, the Devil Ship. Its proper name was HMS Nemesis, and it represented the future of warfare, a future in which courage and numbers and fighting spirit would count for nothing against industrial technology. The Nemesis was the first iron-hulled warship ever used in combat. Built in 1839 by the Laird shipyard in Liverpool, it was constructed not for the Royal Navy, but for the East India Company. Even here, the plausible deniability continued. This was technically a private vessel owned by a commercial enterprise that happened to be waging war on behalf of the British Crown. The ship's specifications were revolutionary. 2 steam engines producing 120 combined horsepower, 18-foot paddle wheels that could drive it forward regardless of wind or current, a shallow draft that allowed it to navigate rivers and coastal waters where sailing ships could not follow, and 2 32-pound swivel cannons that could fire in any direction, raking enemy positions with grape shot and explosive shells. Against this technological marvel, the Chinese fielded weapons that would have been familiar to their ancestors 3 centuries earlier. The standard Chinese firearm was a matchlock musket, a design that traced back to Portuguese weapons from 1548. Matchlocks required the shooter to apply a lit slow match to a touch hole in order to fire. They were slow to reload, inaccurate, and nearly useless in rain or wind. Only 30 to 40% of Chinese soldiers had firearms at all. The rest carried swords and spears and bows. Chinese artillery was equally antiquated. Their cannons sat on mere blocks of wood, lashed down with rattans unable to traverse or adjust elevation. Many were so old that they could not be safely fired without risking explosion. The British were fighting with the weapons of 1840. The Chinese were fighting with the weapons of 1540. The battles that followed were not battles, they were massacres. At the Battle of the Bogue on February 26, 1841, British forces attacked the fortifications guarding the approach to Canton. The Chinese defenders fought with desperate courage, knowing that they were hopelessly outmatched, knowing that their weapons could barely scratch the iron sides of the Nemesis. When the smoke cleared, the British had suffered 5 men wounded, not 5 dead, 5 wounded, 0 fatalities. Chinese casualties were approximately 500 killed or wounded. Among the dead was Admiral Guan Tianpei, who refused to retreat and died at his post defending the gates of Anunghoi Fortress. Even his enemies honoured him. The HMS Blenheim fired a salute of minute guns in recognition of his bravery. But bravery could not stop British shells, and Chinese courage could not compensate for 3 centuries of technological disadvantage. At the Battle of Chapu in May of 1842, 300 Manchu bannermen, the elite hereditary soldiers who formed the core of the imperial military, refused to surrender when their position was overrun. They barricaded themselves inside a Buddhist temple and fought until British forces brought up artillery and set the building ablaze. When the flames died down and the British entered the ruins, they found something that haunted even hardened soldiers. Manchu women and children who had taken poison or been killed by their own family members rather than face capture. They had been told what the barbarians would do to them. They chose death instead. At the Battle of Qingqiang in July of 1842, the British captured the junction of the Yangtze River and the Grand Canal. This was the decisive blow. The Grand Canal was the lifeline of the empire, carrying grain from the productive south to feed the population of Beijing. By cutting it, the British were threatening to starve the capital into submission. Chinese resistance at Qingqiang was fierce. British casualties reached their highest point of the war, with 34 to 39 killed and over 100 wounded. But Chinese casualties were catastrophic. Mass suicides among the bannermen and their families. The commander Hai Lin ordered his own house set ablaze and burned to death inside, rather than survive the disgrace of defeat. The British called these engagements battles. The Chinese had another word. They called them massacres. The final accounting tells the story. British combat deaths for the entire war, approximately 500. Another 500 died of disease. Chinese military dead, over 20,000. That is a ratio of 40 to 1. And the civilian casualties, the families who died in the crossfire, the cities that were looted, the villages that were burned, those numbers were never counted. On August 29, 1842, Chinese officials boarded HMS Cornwallis, anchored in the harbour of Nanjing, and signed the document that would define their nation's humiliation for the next century. The Treaty of Nanking was designed to accomplish 2 things. First, to impose devastating terms on China. Hong Kong Island was ceded to Britain in perpetuity. 5 ports, Canton, Amoy, Foochow, Ningpo, and Shanghai, were opened to British trade and residents. China was forced to pay an indemnity of $21 million, approximately $6 million for the opium that Lin Zexu had destroyed, $3 million to cover debts owed to British merchants, and $12 million for the cost of the war itself. British subjects were granted extraterritoriality, meaning they could not be tried under Chinese law, no matter what crimes they committed on Chinese soil. The Kohong monopoly was abolished. Diplomatic equality was imposed, ending the traditional tributary system under which foreign nations had approached the Chinese emperor as inferiors. But the treaty was also designed to hide what the war had really been about. Opium was not mentioned. Not once. The drug that had caused the conflict that had been the entire reason for British merchants' presence in China in the first place was simply omitted from the official record. This was deliberate. To mention opium would have proven the critics right. It would have confirmed that Britain had waged war to protect drug dealers, that the blood spilled and the treasure spent had been in service of addiction and profit rather than honour or principle. So the quiet part stayed quiet. Opium was not legalized by the Treaty of Nanking. It was simply not addressed. The trade continued as before, only now it continued under the protection of British military power. The smugglers kept smuggling. The addicts kept dying. The silver kept flowing, and Lin Zexu, the man who had tried to stop it all, was recalled to Beijing in disgrace, blamed for provoking a war that China could not win, and exiled to the remote northwest, where he would spend years in obscurity before being rehabilitated. The hero had failed, the drug dealers had won, and the century of humiliation had begun. The Treaty of Nanking had ended the First Opium War, but it had not satisfied British ambitions. The treaty opened 5 ports, but British merchants wanted more. The treaty preserved Chinese sovereignty in theory, but British officials wanted dominance in practice. The treaty left opium technically illegal, but everyone knew the trade continued and would continue until China was forced to accept it openly. For 14 years, an uneasy peace held. British merchants established themselves in the treaty ports, building warehouses and residences and churches. The opium kept flowing, now protected by the implicit threat of British military power. Chinese resentment simmered, and in London strategists waited for an opportunity to finish what the First War had started. That opportunity came on October 8, 1856, in the form of a small vessel called the Arrow. The Arrow was a launcher, a Chinese-owned ship with a European-style hull that had been registered in Hong Kong under British authority. On that October morning, Chinese Marines boarded the vessel in Canton Harbour and arrested 12 of its crew members on suspicion of piracy and smuggling. It was a routine enforcement action of exactly the kind that happened regularly in the busy waters of the Pearl River Delta. But British Consul Harry Parkes saw something else. He saw a pretext. Parkes immediately demanded the release of the crew and a formal apology, claiming that the boarding had violated British sovereignty because the Arrow flew the British flag. He did not mention one crucial detail. The ship's British registration had expired on September 27th, 11 days before the incident. The Arrow was no longer legally a British vessel. The flag it flew was a lie. None of this mattered to Parkes or to his superiors in London. They had their casus belli, their justification for war, and they intended to use it. When news of the Arrow incident reached Parliament, the debate was furious. Richard Cobden introduced a motion declaring that the papers presented by the government failed to establish satisfactory grounds for the violent measures resorted to. William Gladstone rose to deliver one of the most blistering condemnations of imperial policy ever heard in the House of Commons. He called it Palmerston's Opium War and declared that he was in dread of the judgments of God upon England for our national iniquity towards China. For a moment it seemed that conscience might prevail. The censure motion actually passed. Parliament voted against the war. But Lord Palmerston was not a man to accept defeat gracefully. He dissolved Parliament and called new elections, campaigning on patriotism and national honour and the need to punish Chinese insolence. The British public gave him an increased majority. The war would proceed. They knew the Arrow incident was a manufactured pretext. They knew the registration had expired. They knew the entire justification was a legal fiction. They went to war anyway. France joined the expedition using its own pretext. A French missionary named Father Auguste Chapdelaine had been arrested in February 1856 for illegally preaching in Guangxi province. He was beaten with leather thongs. His teeth were knocked out. He was left to die in an iron cage. It was a brutal execution, and France was outraged. Historians have noted that there is no doubt Chapdelaine's death was exploited for imperialist gain. The missionary became a martyr whose memory justified conquest. The combined Anglo-French expedition began its work in late 1857, bombarding and capturing Canton as a first step. But then something unexpected happened, something that gave China a brief, desperate moment of hope. The Second Battle of the Taku Forts on June 25, 1859, was a disaster for the Allies. The Taku Forts guarded the approach to Tianjin and from there the road to Beijing itself. Mongol General Sengye Rinchen had studied the First War carefully. He understood that Chinese forces could not match British firepower in open battle, so he did not offer open battle. He positioned his forces brilliantly, taking advantage of the geography of the high river and its surrounding mudflats. When the British and French forces attempted to land, they found themselves trapped by low tide. Their gunboats ran aground in the shallow water, their landing parties sank into mud that reached their waists, and Senge Rinchen artillery opened fire. 4 British gunboats were sunk, 2 more were severely damaged. Allied casualties exceeded 400. It was the worst British naval defeat since the War of 1812. It was proof that Chinese forces were not helpless, that with good leadership and favourable conditions they could match Western military power. For a moment the empire dared to hope. Perhaps the barbarians could be stopped. Perhaps China could defend itself after all. That hope died the following year. The 1860 expedition was not a punitive raid, it was an invasion. Britain sent 11,000 troops. France sent 6,700. 173 ships carried this force across the sea. There would be no mistakes this time, no underestimation of Chinese resistance, no opportunities for Chinese victories. The Third Battle of the Taku Forts on August 21st, 1860 lasted only hours. The fortifications that had held the previous year fell to overwhelming force. Senge Rinchen retreated, hoping to make a stand closer to the capital. He got his chance at Balikiao on September 21st, 1860. It should have been a decisive moment. Senge Rinchen's force included his elite Mongolian cavalry, the finest horsemen in Asia, descendants of the armies that had conquered half the world under Genghis Khan. They charged the Allied lines in waves flags, flying lances levelled, riding with the same courage and skill that had terrified enemies for 6 centuries. They rode into the mouths of modern artillery. The Armstrong guns that the British had brought to China were breech-loading, rifled artillery pieces capable of firing explosive shells with devastating accuracy at ranges the Mongolian cavalry could not comprehend. The charges were brave, the charges were futile. Allied casualties for the entire battle were 5 killed and 47 wounded. Chinese casualties exceeded 1,500 dead on the field alone. Total losses for the campaign would exceed 25,000. Senge Rinchen's elite Mongolian cavalry was, as one British observer noted, completely annihilated. With the army destroyed, the road to Beijing lay open. The emperor fled the capital, and the Allied forces turned their attention to a target that would demonstrate to China and to the world exactly what defiance of Western power would cost. The Yuanmingyuan was called the Old Summer Palace in English, but that translation conveys nothing of what it actually was. 350 hectares of gardens, palaces, pavilions, temples and treasures built and refined over 150 years by generations of emperors. It was China's Versailles and its Louvre combined. A place of extraordinary beauty where the emperors retreated from the formality of the Forbidden City to live among landscapes designed to represent paradise on earth. The palace complex contained irreplaceable treasures accumulated over millennia, paintings by masters whose names were legend, calligraphy by emperors and scholars dating back 1,000 years, rare books and manuscripts from the imperial library, silks embroidered with gold thread, jade carvings of surpassing delicacy, bronzes cast in forms that could never be replicated, porcelains from every dynasty of Chinese history. There were also European buildings designed by Jesuit missionaries in the 18th century, Baroque palaces with elaborate fountains. A fusion of Eastern and Western architecture that existed nowhere else on Earth. This is what Lord Elgin ordered destroyed. The pretext was the Parkes affair. On September 18, 1860, a British diplomatic party led by Harry Parkes, the same consul who had manufactured the Arrow incident, was captured by Chinese forces during negotiations. Approximately 39 men were taken prisoner. They were treated brutally. Their limbs were bound so tightly that the flesh became infected with maggots. Some had dung forced into their mouths. Some were executed by decapitation. Of the 39 captured, about 20 died, including Thomas Bowlby, the correspondent for the Times of London. Elgin wanted revenge, but he also wanted to send a message that would never be forgotten. On October 18, 1860, between 3,500 and 4,000 British troops entered the Summer Palace with orders to burn it to the ground. The fire burned for 3 days. The smoke could be seen from Beijing, 20 miles away, a black column rising into the autumn sky. Soldiers who participated in the destruction later described what they had seen and what they had done. Charles Gordon, who would later become famous as Gordon of Khartoum, wrote that you could scarcely imagine the beauty and magnificence of the places we burnt. It made one's heart soar to burn them. In the chaos of the destruction, approximately 300 servants, eunuchs and palace maids who had hidden in locked rooms perished in the flames. When it was over, only 13 structures remained standing. Chinese government estimates now place the number of items looted from the Summer Palace at 1.5 million. These treasures are scattered across nearly 50 countries, held in museums and private collections around the world. Some have been repatriated, most have not. Victor Hugo wrote a letter condemning the destruction that has become one of the most famous indictments of imperialism ever penned. "We call ourselves civilized and then barbarians," he wrote. Here is what civilization has done to barbarity. The Convention of Peking, signed on October 24th and 25, 1860, imposed the final terms. Kowloon Peninsula was ceded to Britain in perpetuity, expanding the Hong Kong colony. China was required to pay an indemnity of 16 million taels, 8 million to Britain, and 8 million to France, representing somewhere between a quarter and nearly half of the Qing government's entire annual revenue. Tianjin was opened as a treaty port. Christian missionaries were granted the right to travel and preach anywhere in China. Russia, not even a combatant in the war, extracted its own price. 600,000 square kilometers of Outer Manchuria were ceded to the Tsar. And finally, at last, the quiet part was said out loud. The opium trade was formally legalized. 21 years after Lin Zexu had destroyed over 1,000 tons of the drug at Human Beach. 21 years after China had tried to protect its people from the poison that was destroying them. The treaty that ended the Second Opium War required China to accept the importation of opium as legitimate commerce subject to tariffs and taxes like any other commodity. What had been smuggled in the shadows was now traded in the open. What had been technically illegal was now sanctioned by international law. The drug dealers had won completely, and the century of humiliation was only beginning. The story we have told so far might seem like ancient history, a tragedy from a distant era when empires did as they pleased and the strong simply took what they wanted from the weak. But before we close this chapter, let us be clear about one thing. The people who did this knew exactly what they were doing. They were not ignorant. They were not deceived. They chose profit over conscience with full knowledge of the consequences. William Gladstone, who would later serve 4 terms as Prime Minister, rose in Parliament in 1840 to deliver what remains one of the most devastating moral condemnations ever spoken in that chamber. A war more unjust in its origin, he said. A war more calculated in its progress to cover this country with permanent disgrace. I do not know and have not read of. Gladstone was not speaking from ignorance. He had studied the dispatches, he had read the reports, he understood precisely what Britain was doing and why. And he declared to his fellow members that he was in dread of the judgments of God upon England for our national iniquity toward China. Sir George Staunton asked the question that should have stopped everything. Is the contest in which we appear to be on the eve of embarking with the Emperor of China a just and necessary war, or an act of cruel and iniquitous aggression? The answer was obvious. The vote proceeded anyway. In an 1843 parliamentary debate, one speaker drew the comparison that captured the moral reality. I am fully convinced, he said, that for the country to encourage this nefarious traffic is as bad, perhaps worse than encouraging the slave trade. Worse than the slave trade. This was said not by Chinese victims or foreign critics, but by a member of the British Parliament describing the actions of his own government. Even Captain Charles Elliot, the British Superintendent of Trade, who had placed the merchants under Crown protection and thereby guaranteed that war would follow, privately condemned what he had been forced to facilitate. In his dispatches, he wrote that no man entertains a deeper detestation of the disgrace and sin of this forced traffic on the coast of China than the humble individual who signs this dispatch. He called the trade intensely mischievous and warned that it was rapidly staining the British character with deep disgrace. A missionary observer put it most bluntly: the great blot on foreigners at Canton, though not all is the opium trade, that the government of British India should be the prime abettors of this abominable traffic is one of the grand wonders of the 19th century. The proud escutcheon of the nation which declaims against the slave trade is thus made to bear a blot broader and darker than any other in the Christian world. They knew. The politicians knew. The merchants knew. The missionaries knew. The naval officers who bombarded Chinese forts knew. Everyone involved understood that they were engaged in something monstrous, and they did it anyway because the profits were too great and the victims were too distant, and the language of civilization and free trade provided cover for what was in reality organized crime on a continental scale. Historian John K. Fairbank, who spent his career studying Chinese history, called the opium trade the most long, continued and systematic international crime of modern times. Consider what the British Empire actually built in China. State-sponsored production through the East India Company monopoly, where over 1 million Indian farmers were coerced into growing poppies under threat of imprisonment. Industrial processing at the Patna and Ghazipur factories, where raw opium was refined into standardized product. Distribution networks through the country traders who purchased opium at Calcutta auctions and shipped it to receiving vessels anchored off the China coast. Bribed officials at every level of Chinese government, from local magistrates to provincial governors, who looked the other way while their countrymen died. Armed smuggling boats, the fast crabs crewed by men with weapons and cannons ready to fight anyone who interfered. And when China attempted to enforce its own laws, military intervention on a massive scale to force the victim nation to accept the poison. This was not trade, this was a cartel, the Sinaloa cartel with a crown, the Medellin cartel with a parliament. By 1858, Britain was shipping 4,500 tons of opium to China every year. That is roughly equivalent to total global illicit opium production in the early 2000s. The British Empire was moving more drugs than every drug cartel on Earth combined would move 2 centuries later. And unlike modern cartels who must hide from law enforcement, the British operated openly, protected by the most powerful navy in the world and justified by the language of legitimate commerce. The architects of this system faced no consequences. William Jardine died wealthy and honoured in 1843, having designed the war that forced China to accept continued drug imports. James Matheson became a baronet, purchased the entire Isle of Lewis for £190,000, built Lewes Castle as his personal residence, and became the second largest landowner in the United Kingdom. His grave is decorated with carved poppies, a final tribute to the source of his fortune. Lord Palmerston, who converted merchant lobbying into imperial policy, who dismissed the Chinese as barbarians who dissolved Parliament rather than accept a vote against his war, became Prime Minister of Great Britain. The drug dealers became aristocrats, the enforcers became statesmen, and the victims became a wounded nation that would spend the next century trying to recover from what had been done to them. The Chinese call the period from 1839 to 1949 the century of humiliation. It began at Human Beach, where Lin Zexu destroyed over 1,000 tons of opium, and it ended only with the communist victory that expelled foreign powers from Chinese soil. For 110 years, China was carved up by foreign nations, the treaty ports, the spheres of influence, the concessions where Chinese law did not apply, the extraterritoriality that meant a British citizen could commit murder on Chinese soil and face only British justice. All of this flowed from the Opium Wars. All of this was the price of defying the drug trade. The ruins of the Summer Palace still stand outside Beijing. They are preserved as what the government calls a patriotic education site. Millions of Chinese visit each year to see what Western civilization did to Chinese culture. The broken columns and crumbled walls are a reminder and a warning. Never forget, never allow this again. When Hong Kong was returned to China in 1997, the ceremony was broadcast to 1 billion viewers. The Chinese government explicitly framed the handover as the closing of a wound that had been open since the Opium Wars. 155 years after the Treaty of Nanking ceded the island to Britain in perpetuity, the last visible scar of the drug war was finally healing. But history does not end, it echoes. In the United States today, over 30 million people struggle with opioid addiction. In 2016 alone, 64,000 Americans died from drug overdoses. The pharmaceutical companies that manufactured these drugs knew they were addictive. They marketed them aggressively anyway. They funded studies that downplayed the risks. They lobbied against restrictions. They created distribution systems designed to maximize consumption regardless of consequences. The pattern is identical. Corporate producers claiming their products are safe when they know they are not. Distribution networks designed to flood vulnerable populations. Regulatory capture that prevents effective oversight. Profits prioritized over lives. The Sackler family, who built their fortune on OxyContin, face lawsuits and public condemnation, but they remain wealthy, just as Jardine and Matheson remained wealthy, just as Palmerston became Prime Minister. The architects of addiction have always found ways to escape accountability. Their victims have not been so fortunate. Jardine Matheson still exists. It is one of the largest conglomerates in Asia, with interests in real estate, retail, hotels, and engineering. Its corporate history celebrates its founders as pioneers of Asian trade. The opium is not mentioned, or if mentioned, it is presented as a footnote rather than the foundation. The company that was built on the destruction of millions of lives is now a respectable multinational corporation. The ledger has been cleaned, but the dead do not forget. And history, if we choose to read it, tells us what empires are willing to do when profit is at stake. The plant is still grown in the mountains of Afghanistan and the hills of Myanmar. The trade still flows through networks that span continents. The profits are still counted in boardrooms and backrooms and government offices. The addicts still die in alleys and bedrooms and emergency rooms. The only thing that changes is who holds the ledger. And the dead cannot object to how they are remembered. This has been the story of the Opium Wars. The story of how one empire became the largest drug cartel in human history. The story of how civilization was used as a mask for crime. The story of how courage and principle were crushed by technology and greed. The story of wounds that have never fully healed and echoes that have never fully faded. Sleep well if you can, and remember,